Okay, welcome everyone this morning. Well, this afternoon now. This is Let's Chat About with Hope and Focus. It's a free monthly webinar series hosted by us. We have developed this series with those in mind living with LCA and IRDs, but it's open to anyone who's interested in what's happening in our communities. My name is Courtney Coates, and I'm the Director of Outreach and Development for Hope and Focus. And before we get started, I just want to take a moment to thank our sponsors for this series. They're AGTC, Dominion Energy, Editas Medicine, Janssen, Mira GTX, ProQR, and Spark Therapeutics. We cannot provide programs such as these without their support. A few housekeeping items. This session is going to last about 45 minutes. Your microphones have been muted and your cameras are off. You can submit questions through the Q&A function, and as time allows, we'll take any questions that come in live or through the chat function. We are recording this session, and after the webinar, we will post the recording to our YouTube channel and send out the link. It's my pleasure today to welcome Ben Shaberman, Senior Director, Scientific Outreach for the Foundation Fighting Blindness. Ben has been reporting on retinal science and research for the Foundation for nearly 17 years. In addition to writing for FFB's electronic and print publications, he presents the latest scientific advancements at local and national events for patients and families, and conducts a variety of science training activities for staff and constituents. He also recently launched the Eye on the Cure podcast series, which is available on most major podcast platforms. Ben enjoys working with constituents one-on-one to help them understand their retinal disease and the research underway that may benefit them. He also leads the company's outreach to eye care professionals throughout the US. Ben has written 3 books, Retina Boy, Jerry's Vegan Women, and The Vegan Monologues, all published by Loyola University in Maryland. And he's earned a Master of Arts in Writing from Johns Hopkins University, a Master of Science in Systems Management from the University of Maryland, and a Bachelor of Science in Computer Information Science from Cleveland State University. Please welcome me in joining Ben.
Well, thanks for having me, Courtney. It's great to be on Let's Chat About.
And we appreciate you as our only returning guest so far on our Let's Chat About. We were grateful to have you as our first guest as well. So we are excited to have you back again. So today's conversation is going to be about advancing treatments into clinical trials. Can you tell us more about the challenges of moving treatments into and through clinical trials?
Sure. So what we usually talk about when we're talking about projects that haven't moved into a clinical trial, we call that preclinical research or lab research. And that's typically done in academic research centers all over the world, many in the US, Europe, Asia. And in those studies, the emerging therapies are evaluated maybe in a petri dish or an animal model. And those studies are by no means inexpensive, but when you are moving that emerging therapy out of those labs into clinical trials, which are essentially human studies, the cost goes up dramatically. And that's a big barrier for researchers who are trying to move their promising therapies that may be working in mouse models, as an example, and getting them into human studies. And the reason that's expensive is manyfold. Number one, once you start moving into humans, you have to pull in the FDA to regulate the trial and to oversee it. When you launch a trial, you submit an application called an investigational new drug application, or IND. We hear that phrase or that acronym all the time. That's a really intensive process. It requires a lot of documentation. It requires safety and toxicology studies in preparation for the trial. You have to demonstrate to the FDA that you can manufacture your therapy in a very consistent and safe manner. It has to be a lot better than the quality that you might be using in your animal studies. And again, you need the money. Usually it's several $1,000,000 just to get into that first stage of a clinical trial. So what ends up happening, researchers, not all academic researchers, are experts in translational work to move therapies into the clinic. So what happens is a lot of these potential therapies don't move forward. They never see the light of day in a clinical trial because of all these issues that I talked about.
Yeah, those are definitely some tough issues, but I understand that FFB has some programs to assist with this. Can you explain a little bit more about those?
Sure. So there are two programs that are really focused on that we directly manage. One is aptly named our Translational Research Acceleration Program. And that's to help researchers whose emerging therapies have shown some early promise in lab studies and help them get the research to the point where they can start thinking about a clinical trial, or maybe to the clinical trial doorstep. And one thing that we don't think about with lab research is, let's say you're studying a gene therapy in a mouse model, and your first iteration of that, your first attempt, may or may not be successful, but odds are you're going to have to repeat that study multiple times to really get it right, to get the dosing right, the formulation potentially, where you inject it in the eye. All those things are factors that you really need to refine before you're ready to start thinking about moving it into humans. So the Translational Research Acceleration Program, the TRAP program, helps researchers do some of that later stage lab work that will help them get, hopefully, to the clinical trial doorstep. And those studies are generally more expensive than earlier lab studies. And the researchers are, of course, keeping the FDA in mind as they do these later stage preclinical studies as well, and thinking about potential commercial partnerships. All those things start getting on the radar screen of researchers who are in the TRAP program.
That's a great help for some of those researchers to bring it to the next level. Do you have some examples of some projects that TRAP has funded?
Sure. So one such project underway right now, as an example, is Paul Yang at the Oregon Health and Science University, KCI Institute in Portland. He is working to develop a neuroprotective treatment, really repurposing a drug called mycophenolate that helps reduce inflammation, and it addresses some other issues that are common to many retinal diseases. So he's had some early success, but he's expanding now the models that he's studying the treatment in to see if he can get some more impressive results and understand the focus of exactly what patients might be helped with this. So that's one example. Another example is some work we're doing for a researcher who has a small molecule for Usher syndrome, type 3A, that's looking really promising. And we're actually helping to fund him with some later stage lab work so he and the group he's with can actually begin the IND process. That's even later stage than what Dr. Yang is working on now. And so many examples of things like that where we're helping, again, these researchers move closer to the clinical trial doorstep.
Great. And you said there were two programs that FFB has. So can you tell us about the second?
So our second program is really taking it. It can take things that are coming out of the TRAP program and from other sources. Things don't have to come out of TRAP for the second program. But the second program is really innovative and exciting. It's called the RD Fund, and it's what we call a venture philanthropy fund. What that means is the money that's invested in these companies, we're hoping to get some return on. So when we invest in a new startup company, like a venture capitalist, we're hoping to get a return on our investment. But if we do get a return, instead of giving that money to investors to put in their pockets, that money goes back into the RD fund itself to fund more research. So the idea with the RD fund is to actually help researchers, usually startup companies, researchers that have worked to form startup companies, actually launch early stage clinical trials. So it's another step forward from where the TRAP program is in many cases. And many of the investments that we're making are either ready to start a clinical trial, maybe in a few months, or maybe a year or a year and a half out. And usually the foundation, we could be investing anywhere from a few to maybe $7 or $8 million, depending on the project. Usually we're not the only investor. There might be a venture capitalist or a family foundation that's investing as well. So what's really cool is the Foundation Fighting Blindness is known for its expertise in the field. So when we invest in something, it's like a seal of approval to other investors that, hey, this project, this company must be pretty good if the foundation's investing in it. So we do a really nice job attracting outside investments because people follow our lead, if you will. And so, excitingly, this whole program is not even really 4 years old. I think it'll be 4 years old in the fall. And already we've committed $120 million to somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 11 projects. I've kind of lost count offhand. But that's a huge critical mass of investment in things that are moving into clinical trials or already in clinical trials. And $120 million in our space is making a huge impact. And really the ultimate goal is once you move something into a clinical trial and help these companies do that, if you can get a sign of efficacy, some early encouraging signal, then hopefully you can attract outside investments from a big biotech or big pharma. That's really the goal, because the early stage clinical trial will cost millions of dollars, but to move it through the whole clinical trial, that'll cost, in many cases, hundreds of millions of dollars. And we need big pharma and biotechs to actually fund that expensive part of clinical trials. And so far, that I think that model is working encouragingly. One company that we funded early on called Videre Bio, they are developing, or their initial project was an optogenetic therapy. And early on, even before they got it into the clinic, it's not in the clinic yet, Novartis came along and acquired the company and will pay up to $280 million for that startup company. That's big money, and that's very, very exciting. So that's an example. That's actually what we call our first exit, using this model, and I think we're poised for more of those, for those exits, if you will, where somebody comes along and buys the company out to advance it further along.
Yeah, that's great to hear and to understand a little bit more how that relationship works for it to get from researcher to small startup to potentially being acquired by a larger, more established biotech or pharma. Are there any other success stories that you've had from the RD fund?
Sure. Well, I think on the LCA front, when you look at Cena Therapeutics, it's sort of a long story if you look at the whole story there, but it's a really compelling story. So back in the mid 90s, when gene therapy was just a vision of some really bright people like Jean Bennett, her husband Al McGuire, their collaborator Bill Hausworth, they all really worked on what ultimately became Luxturna. But a lot of great work was coming out of the University of Florida at the time, and it moved into other labs as well. Well, one of the people in Dr. Hausworth's lab was a young investigator named Shannon Boy. And Shannon was early in her career. She really hadn't gotten much funding from anybody yet. We gave her one of her first significant grants, if not the first significant grant, to do gene therapy development. And I forget how many years ago that was. That was a while back. But since then, Shannon has really established a world-class gene therapy lab at the University of Florida. And she and her husband, Sanford, I think it's about 2 years ago, launched their own company called Cena Therapeutics, which is funded by the RD Fund to advance gene therapies for retinal diseases into clinical trials. And they've already launched a clinical trial for LCA caused by mutations in the gene GUCY2D. And with the low doses of that therapy, that gene therapy, they had some encouraging results. There were 3 patients who had some modest vision improvements. And they continue to dose at higher levels, and hopefully they'll continue to see vision improvements for those patients. But that's a great example of something that really we got started on really early on, 25 years ago maybe. Helped somebody really early in their career get their footing in the gene therapy field, and thanks to her growth as an investigator, has been able to launch a company with our funding, and they're doing great work. They also have gene therapies in development for X-linked retinoschisis, as well as Usher syndrome type 1B.
Yeah, it's a great testament to the program and its ability to forward research. And, it'll be exciting to hear of more developments as they come.
Sure.
I know one of the other things that Hope and Focus has supported of the FFB's efforts are BioBonds. Can you tell our group a little bit more about how those work?
Sure. So I hope I've made it somewhat clear that translational research can be challenging because it's expensive. There are challenging things to do to work with the regulators and so on. And as I said really at the beginning of this discussion, a lot of great research doesn't make it into clinical trials because of those challenges. Well, one of our board members, a board director of the Foundation Fighting Blindness, and her late husband, the person I'm referring to is Karen Petru, and her, again, late husband, Basil. They have been partners with a consulting firm on Capitol Hill called Federal Financial Analytics. And the bottom line is Karen is an outstanding expert on federal financial policy, and she's looked to by government, private organizations, Wall Street, whomever, to get guidance on federal financial policy. And her and Basil, 6, 7, 8 years ago, I've sort of lost track of time, they decided to come up with a new instrument to help researchers launch clinical trials. And the instrument, the idea behind it is to give loans to researchers that they have to pay back to do their research. And the idea behind that is, rather than giving researchers a handout or forcing them to give up an equity stake in their company, the idea behind a loan is, if you're going to create a federal program to do this, it's not going to have a big impact on the national debt. It's not going to have an impact on the taxpayer burden. And so back in, if I remember my chronology correctly, the first incarnation of this legislation was called BioBonds. And this was launched in about this time back in 2018. I think it was May or June of 2018. It was launched in Congress, and subsequently we got some good co-sponsors, weren't able to get it passed. And the next 2 years later, when a new Congress came along, it was reintroduced again as BioBonds. Again, we got some momentum, but we weren't able to get it across the finish line. But then about a year ago, Karen and the lobbying team that we work with decided to expand the scope of what this legislation would fund from beyond the eye to any condition or disease. It's for all biomedical research. And so now they're called BioBonds. And these BioBonds were introduced with co-sponsors Bobby Rush and Brian Fitzpatrick. Bobby Rush is out of Chicago, veteran congressman and Democrat. Fitzpatrick is a Republican. And over the past nearly a year, we've worked hard to get co-sponsors and supporting organizations like Hope and Focus or other nonprofits that fund research or provide support for diseases on board with the legislation. And what I can say is we still have more work to do, and I don't mean to be cryptic, but we have some encouraging potential with some new potential partners that really this is something relatively new in our work to get BioBonds across the finish line. And what I can say is stay tuned as we work to move the legislation forward. One thing I'll say, my role at the foundation, I've been involved in communicating science and research. That's my wheelhouse. When I got called in to be a part of the BioBonds and then the BioBonds team, I did not have an appreciation for the challenges of getting a bill through Congress, especially these days where I don't think it's a surprise to anybody how difficult Congress is right now, politically speaking. And then you throw in issues like COVID, inflation, the conflict in the Ukraine, and it really makes it challenging to get legislation across the finish line. But between Karen's determination, the great work of our lobbying firm, Aiken Gump, and those of us at the foundation, we're keeping at it. And we've, again, had some encouraging recent developments. Stay tuned. But we're not giving up. And if people are interested in trying to help us get this legislation passed, what they can do is they can contact their legislative representative, their House member, and even their senator to ask for support, or at a minimum raise awareness about the legislation. And I'll repeat, what's so innovative about it is that the researchers need to pay the loans back, so it's not a handout. And I think that makes it attractive to fiscal conservatives as well as people who obviously want to get more treatments across the finish line.
Yeah, I think that makes it very appealing for the bipartisan support. And I think that's a really clear way we can have our constituents get involved, is, to have them be supportive with their own local representatives as we try to progress this legislation. One
thing I'll add is, if people want to learn more about the legislation, they can go to biobonds.org, and there's all kinds of information, articles. It has a list of co-sponsors, and my email address is on that website, so they can email me directly.
Great. And we have dropped that in the chat for anyone who would like to be able to click directly through to biobonds.org. So thank you, Ben, for that. Another question that we have here is that the amount of funding it takes can be overwhelming for individuals or families to think about having to raise for their own treatments. Do you have any thoughts you can share about that?
So that's a really good question. And if we're going to get treatments out to the people who need them, they need to be accessible from a financial standpoint. And we're aware of that. I'm not going to say we're experts in the reimbursement issues, but what I will say is that Spark Therapeutics, who developed Luxturna, have done a really good job working with insurers, both public and private insurers, to get coverage for Luxturna gene therapy so families can afford it. And I think I'm pretty confident, for the most part, the out-of-pocket expenses for families has been very minimal, if not non-existent. I haven't talked to Spark in the last several months about it, but I know for the first few years of the program, just about all of the out-of-pocket expenses were covered for Luxturna.
Yeah. And Spark's going to be doing some education for us later this year to talk about that more and explain that. But I think even earlier in the process, even from the research stage, I think drawing that connection of fundraising sometimes is being asked of families, and it's a little bit confusing sometimes for them to navigate.
Certainly. And I guess one thing I will say is, at the foundation, we have many different ways that we fundraise. And some of them involve things like events and walks. We have a direct mail campaign. I shouldn't call it a campaign, where we do direct mail solicitations year round. We have all kinds of programs to suit whatever level of giving somebody wants to do. So we understand it can be a tough world out there financially for a lot of families, and we appreciate that. And we appreciate whatever people are able to donate to the cause, whether it's directly to us or through Hope and Focus. You guys are great about giving us money for research, so supporting you directly benefits us. But yeah, it can be challenging. But there are a number of ways that we can help people participate, recognizing that obviously if somebody is raising a child with visual impairments, or they're an adult with visual impairments, there can be additional costs to help people navigate the sighted world with visual impairments.
Yeah. And I think that was a great point, is fundraising through organizations like ours eventually go through FFB specifically for LCA therapies, but, we have the gift of the FFB's oversight in looking into trusted sources. So we do appreciate that. I just want to open up to the audience to drop their Q&As into the chat so we can make sure to have those ready for you.
And one other thing I wanted to mention is, I guess speaking personally, since the beginning of my career with the foundation, I've always been inspired by patients and families and how courageously and successfully so many families are coping with these challenging conditions. And it's not easy, and for some families have been more successful than others, and that's understandable. But one thing that a lot of families have done really well is to inspire their friends and family members to help in the fundraising. And that can be a really effective way to play a part in our missions, whether it's the Hope and Focus mission, the Foundation's mission, is to get your friends and family involved. And not only, obviously, we appreciate the financial end of it, but I think the stories that come out of our organizations are incredibly inspiring. I know they are for me. And by telling one story or your family story, you can really pull people into the mission, even people who aren't directly impacted by these conditions.
Yeah, that's a great point. I know that sometimes it can be daunting when we're talking in the millions of dollars, but I think understanding at that basic research level, we're talking more in the thousands. Am I correct? I know Hope and Focus has funded several number of small studies, and that's really what gets the ball rolling too.
You know what I think Hope and Focus has done such a great job of is supporting, and I haven't talked about this, our genetic testing and registry program. Because though a genetic test isn't expensive compared to research, but for many families it can still be a significant cost. If you weren't getting genetically tested through our no-cost program, it might cost $1,000 or $2,000. But through Hope and Focus's support of our program, we can give that to families for no cost at all. And that includes genetic counseling, and there's the registry, which is no cost, and that can really help people get on the radar screen of researchers and sponsors conducting clinical trials.
Yeah. And we've talked a lot about fundraising. Do you think that is one of the biggest challenges facing industry, or is it regulation, or is it something else?
I think the biggest challenge really is getting a treatment to the point where the companies with the deep pockets will invest. And that gets back to what we've been talking about in terms of especially the RD fund or the TRAP program of trying to address that particular challenge. Because one thing really nice about the retina is it's a fairly accessible piece of tissue. It's a small piece of tissue. You can get to it fairly easily compared to other parts of the body. I know no one likes to think about getting needles or procedures on their eyes, but those are easier than maybe something that's going on in your skull or behind your rib cage. So I say this because the retina can be an excellent proving ground for things like cell therapies and genetic therapies, because it is accessible and you don't need a lot of the therapy to treat the patient. So that's a really attractive aspect of our field. And when you look at the number of companies that have moved into our field over the past decade, that just really confirms what I'm saying, because dozens of companies are now in our field. We just have to get the treatments to the point where they'll invest in the trials.
Yeah. And is that more of a business issue? Is it more of a science issue? Like, I know that these programs are providing funding. Is that really all that they need to get them to that next point?
Well, what we often say is the science is there, it's the money needed to fund those clinical trials, especially the later stages. That's the biggest challenge.
Yeah. And then from there, how do our individuals living with learn about these clinical trials, and how do they get involved to support?
Sure, that's a great question. I encourage people, you can visit the Hope and Focus website, definitely, to get involved. If you want to learn about the research that's going on, the clinical trials, our website, fightingblindness.org, is a great resource of information. One of my roles is to write articles about the research. So we have a lot of articles that I've put together and we've gotten from industry to put on our website. We have a clinical trials pipeline chart, which we keep up to date on the website. We do all kinds of our own webinars, national webinars on a regular basis. We hold events in local communities that are educational, lots of different ways. And I also host a podcast called I Am the Cure, which is very fun for me to do, and I get to interview researchers and other people in our space to talk about what's going on and what looks promising.
Yeah, those are some great ways for everyone to get involved. And I'll give everyone one last chance to get any questions in for Ben in the chat, because we've really appreciated understanding more about this process today. I think it's one of the most overwhelming things sometimes for a new family to understand.
And what I want to say is this, in terms of watching the science move forward. Science, by its nature, moves slowly. It's just it is what it is. I'm not a big fan of that phrase, but I still use it. It is what it is. To do science right, you need time. You need good regulation. You can't just drop something into a patient and hope it works. You really need to be methodical in development. But every therapy for any condition in our world has gone through the scientific process. So there are thousands of success stories. So while I totally understand that people who have a retinal disease, or a child or a loved one with a retinal disease, feel an urgent need to get to see things happen, I understand that things just don't happen as quickly as we'd like. But they do happen. They do move forward. And if you look at our space, if you go back, I want to say, really to 2007, 2008, when the first clinical trials began, well, those were the first clinical trials in our space, really. You move forward 15 years, and now we have over 40 trials. So in 15 years, a lot has happened. It can never happen quickly enough, but through the programs that Courtney, you and I have talked about today, we're doing everything in our power to accelerate that clinical development. But at the end of the day, science takes time, and I know that's challenging.
Yeah, but I think it really speaks to there's so much hope out there right now, and that's really why our name is what it is, hope and focus, where there's a lot to be said for how much has really happened. So we're thankful for that and thankful for your time in explaining all that for us today, Ben.
Sure.
Um, Thank you. And I just want to put out to everyone, Hope and Focus is conducting a community survey right now, and we are hoping the feedback from that survey will also help to inform our organization as well as our industry partners. So if you can please take a few moments to take the survey, whether you're an individual living with LCA or a caregiver or a family member, we'd love to hear from you. That link was just dropped into the chat, and we would love your response so that we can compile that important information for our industry. And if you haven't signed up for our newsletter yet, please sure to do that as well. Ben always has a lovely column in there with some great information. So, we really just want to get that information out to our community. Okay, and with that, I don't see any other questions, and we're at our 45 minutes. So just want to thank you for your time today, Ben, and just remind everyone this will be recorded and on our YouTube channel later.
Great. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you so much. Have a great day.
You too.